Welcome everyone to another video in our series that explores sample records management configurations in M-Files using AutoRecords. As with all of our samples, the details of this configuration are available in the online documentation for AutoRecords. Working samples using these configurations are also available in a sample vault which you can download from TeamIM and begin experimenting with today. All of our sample videos and documentation assume you're familiar with records management concepts, the M-Files user interface, and that you have basic understanding of AutoRecords. In this session, we're going to see how to set up a fairly complex configuration where we have an employee object on M-Files, and we want to remove documents which reference the employee once the employment status for the employee changes. To make it even more challenging, we want to dispose of certain documents at different times after the employee changes status. We'll walk through all the steps to set up this configuration as if there are no existing configurations on the system. We'll start by creating a new policy object in M-Files. First, we need to give the policy a name. Policy names should be consistent, so when we're reviewing all of the policies on the system, the list is fairly well organized. It's worth considering whether we want the policy name to include a description of retention or just the documents and objects that are included. Generally, we recommend the policy name reflects the types of documents or objects contained in the policy, since describing various types of retention that can be applied may get a bit unwieldy. Using this example, we may want the name to be Employees and Related Documents, since this policy will handle retention for both the employee object and documents related to the employee object. The next thing we'll do is select the class or classes that belong in this policy. When setting up retention like this, where retention for documents is based on some object they refer to, like an employee, we only specify the class of the object that will carry the retention. In this case, it's the employee class. We're not specifying any document classes at this point. The employee object will be responsible for driving our retention. With the employee class selected, we can begin to set up the retention category. The retention category gets assigned to all employees and schedules an event or events to perform retention actions. Taking a closer look at the retention category, we have a few bits of information to provide. Starting at the top, the ID is a number that you assign to uniquely identify the retention category. Many records management standards require that each retention category have a unique numeric ID. As you build out your file plan, you may want to use this ID to group retention categories together. While in most cases, retention categories are generally not specific to certain types of documents, in this case we're setting up retention that is intended only for employees and their documents, since our retention will be based on the status of the employee. We'll see how this works in just a moment. Continuing through the retention category setup, the retention category label is a free-form text field. As a best practice, this field should describe the events that will be scheduled by this retention category. Since we have multiple events that can be scheduled by this retention category, the name is set up to indicate all events that will be scheduled. Once the label has been set, the retention category name is automatically set as a combination of the ID and the label. The last thing we need to set up for this example are the event templates that will be used to schedule events to delete the employee and the employee documents at different times. Let's take a closer look at how these event templates are set up. For this example, we will set up several event group templates. The event group templates dictate what retention actions will be performed and when. Event group templates are used to schedule events for groups of documents. In this case, employee documents will have an event scheduled so they get deleted 1 year after the employee becomes a former employee. Event group templates use a pattern of after some triggering criteria is met, wait some period of time, and then perform some action. And the best practice for naming event group templates is to reflect the triggering criteria, how long we will wait, and what we will do. So let's take a look at how we set it up in this case. To configure an event group template, the first part to supply is the name. In this case, we'll follow our best practice and set the name to delete former employee documents after 1 year. Next, we need to specify the trigger, which is the criteria that will be used to control when retention events should be scheduled. For this event group, we want to use something called an indirect trigger. An indirect trigger means that information that triggers retention for a document is not on the document itself, but it is obtained indirectly from some related document or object. In this case, that's the employee. Like any other trigger, an indirect trigger is used to evaluate the value of a property, and when the condition is met, the trigger evaluates to true. The trigger name will automatically be created once we filled in the remaining values. The trigger property we'll be using is the employment status of the employee. The comparator will be equal to, and the value will be former employee. For indirect triggers, we also need to specify information about how documents are linked to the employee object. The relationship direction asks us how that relationship is established. In this case, the documents have a property which references the employee object, so the relationship goes from the document to the employee. This is the most common type of relationship. We would use the to or direct relationship when a property on the employee object references the document directly. The next thing we need to configure is the property on the document that points to the employee object. In this case, it's the employee property. If there are documents which reference an employee through a different property, such as a manager property, which selects employees who have been designated as managers, additional indirect triggers will need to be set up to handle those cases. We will not set any relationship classes on this indirect trigger. The classes set here would identify the documents or objects that should get the retention we're configuring. If nothing is specified, it means all classes which reference an employee will get this retention. We need to think of this as a catch-all. It's very important to remember that these classes are not just limited to documents. If there are non-document objects associated with an employee, such as a protected data object, it will also receive this retention and will be deleted in 1 year. Careful consideration should be given here because you may have objects such as a supervisor or department that reference an employee. Those may be inadvertently included in the retention. Exceptions for certain types of objects can be set up in the admin utility if needed. Please see the documentation for more details on that. However, in this case, we've only got documents that reference an employee, so we'll set this up as our catch-all. Later on, we'll specify that HR documents get deleted after 7 years, and tax and insurance documents after 10 years, and AutoRecords will automatically apply the most precise match when it comes to using event templates to schedule events for a document. Another important configuration is the action retention object property. This determines whether the employee object should have the retention that's specified here. In this case, we don't want to delete the employee yet. We'll do that once the tax and insurance documents are removed in 10 years. Finally, since employment status is a select list property, behind the scenes, mFiles associates an ID with each possible value. To ensure we are comparing to the proper value, we must add the employment status property to the trigger metadata card and set the value to former employee. The value of former employee that we typed into the trigger value field above is not used for comparison with select list properties. It is, however, used to automatically generate the name of the trigger. With the triggering criteria set, next we need to specify how long we're going to wait before we perform retention. To specify how long we wait before performing the retention action, we specify a time period which consists of a period of time, which will be set to years, and then we set 1 as the duration. And with that, the period is set up. The last thing we need to do is select the action we want to perform. Since we're going to delete the file, we will use a direct action which is performed directly against the file and does not invoke mFile's workflows to do additional retention work. The direct action we will choose is delete and destroy. AutoRecords also supports a soft delete, but we'll want to actually destroy the file in this case. One final thing to point out is that it's very likely that the employee object has a workflow which sets workflow states. While it's tempting to use workflow states to drive retention, it is not recommended. Workflows are tailored to particular business processes which are almost always relatively short in duration. Retention, on the other hand, is often measured in years. Using employees as an example, it's likely that the employee workflow will be changed multiple times over the course of the employment of the person by different people, some of whom will likely have very little knowledge of retention policies. Relying on workflow states for retention will likely create future risks as the workflow changes. In this case, we've added a property for employment status, which we'll use to drive retention and help insulate our retention policy from being inadvertently affected as workflow changes are made in the future. The next event group template we set up is nearly identical to the previous one with only a few minor changes. For this event group, we'll be deleting HR documents for former employees after 7 years, and we'll supply that as a name. Next, we'll set up the indirect trigger for these documents. As with the previous example, we'll trigger based on employment status, equal to, a former employee, and set our relationship direction for the document so it points from the document to the employee. We'll also set the relationship property to employee. Now we get to the biggest difference for this trigger when we set the relationship classes. Here we specify all the document classes that reference an employee and should have the 7-year retention. Once that's set, we again indicate that we don't want to perform this retention against the employee object. And finally, since the employment status is a select field, we have to remember to add the property employment status and select the value we want to compare it to. With the trigger set up, we can now configure the period, and this time we'll specify years and set the value to 7. And finally, we select the direct action to delete and destroy these documents. And with that, we've completed this event group configuration. The last event group template we set up is for the 10-year retention on tax and insurance documents. Importantly, this event group template has one small change that will cause it to also delete the employee object once all of the documents have been deleted. Looking at this configuration, as with previous examples, we supply a name and then configure the indirect trigger. Again, we set the trigger property of employment status equal to former employee, and the relationship direction for the document is still from the document to the employee, and the relationship property is still employee. Next, we add the tax and insurance document classes that should receive this retention, and now we set the action retention object to yes. This will cause the employee object to be deleted along with these documents. And finally, we need to remember again that since our trigger is using a select list, we need to add the employment status property and set it to former employee. With that, we can set the period and specify years with a value of 10, and finish this configuration by specifying that we want to delete and destroy these documents along with the employee object. With that, our configuration is complete. We've created 3 main configurations. Our policy selects all the employees and assigns a retention category to the employees. Our retention category schedules 1 of 3 events for each document associated to the employee. The event group templates shown in green are set up so based on the document class, the appropriate event group template will be used to schedule an event. Importantly, if a document class is changed for a document that refers to an employee, the retention will respond to that change. For each event group template, we created an indirect trigger which specifies the document classes that will receive that particular retention. The first event group template is our catch-all for any documents that aren't specified in other indirect triggers. The next indirect trigger is for the HR documents. Our final indirect trigger is for tax and insurance documents as well as the employee object itself. Once AutoRecords runs, it will automatically create all the objects, and mFiles will create all the associations between the policy, the retention category, the event templates, and in this case we have indirect retention categories as well. These are automatically created and maintained by AutoRecords to control the various types of documents associated to this employee. As we can see here, an indirect retention category links back to the source retention assigned to the employee and helps the records manager confirm that the retention assigned to the employee is cascading down to the appropriate documents. We can also see this retention by looking at the employees and examining the actual documents. When looking at an employee, we will see all the events scheduled for the employee to handle retention for the various types of documents. And if we were to look at a document, we would see the indirect retention category which has been assigned to that document. Importantly, the events that will be performing retention are scheduled based on the employee and not the individual document. If we expand the events associated to our employee, we can see the event date for each of the different types of retention. In this case, our catch-all retention for most of the employee documents will occur on February 5th, 2025, or 1 year after the employee became a former employee. With the mFiles 360-degree view and all of the relationships established by AutoRecords, it's easy for a records manager to implement a fairly complex retention policy yet still have easy access to retention information. As we wrap up this video, we hope you found it helpful, and we want to encourage you to check out our other sample configuration videos to learn how the power and flexibility of records management in mFiles can help your organization achieve its compliance and records management goals. For more information about records management in mFiles with AutoRecords, please contact mFiles or Team IM. Thank you for watching.